Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Middle East Institute. I'm Marvin Weinbaum, and I am director of our Afghanistan and Pakistan studies here at the Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome you this afternoon for today's timely and I think important panel on the Taliban, and most explicitly on some of the unanswered questions that we have about the Taliban. I think it's particularly important now that we are trying to engage the Taliban in a dialogue which could lead to a peace process and ultimately some kind of end to the conflict in the country. We have lots of unanswered questions, and what we're hoping to do today is to at least scratch the surface of what we know, because there's so much we don't know and perhaps at this point in time can't know about the organization, which has evolved over these 17 years. So the format we're going to use here is I have a set of questions which I'm going to pose to the panel, and unfortunately, one of our panelists has not yet arrived, but we will have to start on time. You have full of biographies of the speakers, panelists, available to you, but let me just briefly introduce those here. On my left here, William Malley. Bill is a professor of diplomacy at the Asia Pacific College. That's at Australian National University, which he was the founding director of that unit. But most of you who follow Afghanistan know Bill Malley very well. He has been one of those authors and commentators about Afghanistan for a long time. I'm aware of it for at least 20 or 25 years. And Bill is truly one of the authorities on the country. And so it's just a pleasure to have him here from Australia. Also with us is Omar Samad. Omar is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council here in Washington, and deals specifically, of course, with South Asia and Central Asia, but most specifically with Afghanistan, because Samad is former ambassador from Afghanistan. Candice, welcome. Not a moment too soon. Let me continue with Omar Samad. Omar has been the Afghan ambassador to France and was ambassador designate to Belgium. And Omar is a familiar figure here in Washington because he's been one of the people who we constantly turn to when we want to have a better grasp on what's going on there, and particularly on his views here on the peace process. Candice Rando. Candice, I am pronouncing that correctly? Candice. But the second name is the one I... You
got it right.
Got it right, okay. Is a professor of practice at the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, and a senior fellow with the Center for the Future of War, which is a joint initiative of ASU and New America Foundation. Many of us know Candice because Candice was, for a number of years, the Washington Post bureau chief in Kabul. She is more recently, certainly, been a strategic advisor to the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, an outfit which is known to most of you, I suspect. Thank you for joining us, Candice. And finally, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague here at the Middle East Institute, Ahmed Majid Yar is really it's been a gem here at the Middle East Institute, and someone who I have really so valued as a colleague. And we've done a number of things together, and in that, before I say anything more, some of you have seen this outside, but you will see it on the web. This is a jointly authored report entitled Afghanistan's Unending Wars, and this is available on the website. And it looks broadly at the fact that Afghanistan, of course, has been in civil war ever since 1978, and tries to show the relevance of what has happened in the past for what is occurring today. Ahmed is a regular contributor to the to media and has published widely. So we're just pleased that he joined the panel as well. So now, if I can stop coughing. Let's begin. I'm going to ask the panel to provide a baseline here for our discussion by briefly addressing, and because we want to have a dialogue here rather than individual presentations, this is very much an interactive panel. At least we hope it will be. So I'm going to ask you first, very briefly, about the Taliban itself. Who leads it? Who does it recruit? How has the Taliban evolved as an organization? Certainly for the last 17 years. So, again, as a baseline in which we can understand here some questions which will follow. Who'd like to start us off? Samad?
Sure. I'll take the easy one.
Omar, I should say.
Thank you. Well, Marvin, thank you for having us here, and thank you for everyone for coming by, and I'm happy that this didn't happen yesterday. But to answer your question, it's sort of ironic that it's been almost 25 years since the Taliban emerged. There are still conflicting accounts of how they emerged, exactly, how they grew, how they evolved, how they gained territory, support inside and outside Afghanistan, what kind of networks feed the Taliban, again, both inside and outside Afghanistan. There are a lot has been written, a lot has been researched, a lot has been looked into over the years, but there's no definitive answer to any of these questions yet. There are still some lingering doubts. There are still questions such as, to what extent does Pakistan control the Taliban? How independent are the Taliban? Has their agenda shifted and evolved since the 1990s till now? Can they be trusted? Have they severed? Are they severing? Can they sever their ties with international terrorism as we have known it in the past? Or they still beholden to them? So they're, interestingly enough, after 25 years of looking at the Taliban, dealing with the Taliban in one way or another, it's still wrapped in a lot of mystery and secrecy. But obviously we do also know a lot more, since Ahmad Rashid, my friend, wrote the that seminal book, The Taliban, back in the 90s. And what we do know, as far as Afghans are concerned, I think, is that their leadership mainly resides outside of Afghanistan. Occasionally, they may come and go. Some do, some don't. Their recruitment is done in two ways. And it has evolved, again. I'm talking about now, the context nowadays. It's from a lot of the refugees remaining in Pakistan, the madrasa system that feeds the Taliban networks. Many of the young who go through training and indoctrination and so on and so forth, and they are part of this madrasa system. That madrasa system used to exist under the Taliban in Afghanistan to some extent, but it has been shut down, except for areas that may be in full control, under full control of the Taliban. The recruitment also takes place inside Afghanistan. We have to admit it. It does take place inside villages. It does take place in cities. And sometimes it takes place beyond Pakistan and Afghanistan. There are foreign fighters who joined the Taliban, have joined the Taliban in the past, and occasionally they still do. They are still being captured occasionally, and they come from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and some other areas. But the Taliban have tried very hard over the years to portray an image of nationalism, especially after the Americans came after 9/11. And they want to obviously give the impression that they're fighting against occupation. That's not exactly how all Afghans see it, but this is the narrative that the Taliban have obviously presented since 9/11. And so they have evolved. Now, we can go later on and look at what they are saying now, how their spokespeople, how their representatives in Moscow, in Doha, in Pakistan, anywhere else, have expressed their views about women's rights, democracy, constitutional rights, governance, everything from even women's health care issues. They're discussing these matters now, and they're, again, providing their sort of updated version of their belief system. Some of it still smells of the 1990s, has a smell of the 1990s, and hasn't changed much. Some of it is doubtful, has to be verified and tested in due time, because we do not know exactly if it's true or not. And thirdly, there's a part that they are very adamant about, and that has to do with the fact that they feel that they are victorious, that they have won the war, that they have to have a say, and that what was denied them in 2001 has to be now provided to them as far as future governance and being part of an Afghan political settlement in the future. How this is going to shape, how it's going to obviously be implemented and agreed to by all other sides, including all other Afghan sides, and the role that the region plays and other countries play, is obviously part of the complexities that we're facing right now. But overall, I would say that there is evolution, there is change, in some areas more than others, but there are a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, a lot of angst and concern about what exactly do the Taliban still believe in, and what kind of Afghanistan they want to be part of, and how can they accept and embrace others, and how can they be embraced by the rest of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Bill.
Thanks, Marvin. Marvin asked me to do a little bit of show and tell, which was not what I was inclined to do. I did a book last year called Transition in Afghanistan, Hope, Despair and the Limits of State Building, and it does have a whole chapter on talking to the Taliban in it, which is the only reason I mentioned it at this point. I have two quick responses to your question. One is conceptual, one's epistemological. The conceptual observation is that we run the risk of imposing on the Taliban a model of leadership which seems to apply in Western circumstances. It's very tempting in negotiations to look for a leader whose word will then bind the rest of his or her group in a way that we associate with agreements under international law. It's not to be assumed automatically that the Taliban has any such leader. It probably did until the death of Mullah Omar. It's much more questionable at this point whether that's the case. And there's much to be said for the characterisation of the Taliban by the German researcher Thomas Hurtig as a network of networks. And that begins to grasp some of the difficulties of any kind of simple notion of leadership within that context. The epistemological observation is the following. My suspicion is we know a lot less about the Taliban than we would like to know, or probably need to know to negotiate comfortably with them. And here I'll just give one example, and it's not designed to be malicious, but in December 2014, the United States Institute of Peace published a report by a very well-known and very widely cited Irish writer on the Taliban who has made a distinguished career commenting on the movement. And the report contained the statement, and I quote, "Mullah Omar remains the Taliban supreme leader and the source of all authority in the movement." Now, he had been dead since April 2013.
Yes.
And there is a lesson there that even people who specialise on the Taliban and spend a great deal of their time interacting with low-level Taliban fighters are not necessarily going to be in a position to call the shots effectively when the questions that are relevant to effective negotiation processes come to the fore.
Yeah, and of course, Bill, lots of Taliban didn't know of his death
That's
either.
right, yeah.
Candice.
Indeed.
I'll be quick. First, I want to apologize for being late. I had a little bit of a Uber spiral. So that happens in this town, as you know, when you're on some sort of angle or corner. I also want to acknowledge a couple people in the room who probably should be sitting at this table. First, obviously, Salma, former national security advisor for a long time in the Karzai administration, and obviously Robin Rafal, a long time hand in South Asia, probably knows more about Afghanistan, Pakistan than I've forgotten, and really, I think is one of the true experts on this topic. But in thinking about this, I had to kind of go back and kind of look at what has happened in the last couple of months. Of course, I continue to track. I lived in Afghanistan for a long time, developments there. I think the way to think about the Taliban is in the same way that Omar has pointed out and Bill has pointed out, it is hard to know it as an organization in the kind of classic sense. It is better to look at it on two tracks, which is a military organization and a political organization. And on those two separate tracks, they've evolved, I think, at different speeds is the best way to describe it. As a military organization, we've seen since 2001 the Taliban evolve into certainly a network of networks, but also a network of networks with a very strong command structure. It may be at times confused, maybe a little bit unclear who's doing what from the outside point of view. But I think we've seen most recently with the ceasefire that there is a command and control structure that is strong enough that kind of national order can be issued and actually followed. That is actually a pretty big evolution from where they were in 2001-2, when they were basically on their back foot and running across the border into Pakistan. A considerable evolution in terms of where they were in 2003 when they were beginning to kind of reconvene and hit from the side in pockets of the southeast of Afghanistan. Now today they have military courts, they have their own military justice system, and that is something that's significant. What that has meant in practical terms is representatives of the Taliban on some level, because they have tried to portray themselves increasingly as a cohesive military organization, have had to have interfaces with the United Nations, have had to have interfaces with the ICRC, with major interlocutors that are responsible for the protection of civilians. And, you know, rhetorically, they've made a lot of statements around the need to protect civilians, to target only military targets. The problem, of course, has always been their view on the range of what constitutes a military target is quite different than what would fall under the Geneva standards today. So as a military organization, we've seen a lot of evolution. We've seen them able to grow their command and control. Their communications, their lines of communications are extensive. They reach, you know, all the way from Peshawar into, of course, the interior of Afghanistan, out to the west of Afghanistan, but also obviously to Doha and to Turkey as well. So that representation is something that certainly we should look at as a sign of a cohesive military body. As a political organization, it definitely falls short in so many different ways of what you would call an organization that could become perhaps the next Sinn Féin of the Afghan war. It is nowhere near what Hizb Islami was in 2008 when we began to hear from the Hizb Islami leadership in Pakistan, and they began making noises about trying to come back in from the cold. They are not at that point for lots of different reasons. And I suspect it's because, as Omar and Bill have pointed out, because the leadership is not very clear. And in fact, there has been always this internal fighting between the military wing, which is much more cohesive, and the political wing, which is much less cohesive. And the messaging there has been mixed. If you might have seen, Al Jazeera ran an interview with Sher Mohammed Stanigzai about 2 weeks ago. And it was pretty interesting, actually, to watch that. First of all, it's the first time we've seen, a face out, a Taliban representative. It's something that certainly I have called for. If you want to pretend that you have interest in peace and peace negotiations, there's got to be a face, and it's got to be a public face. Whether or not Sher Mohammed Stanigzai, in fact, really represents much in terms of the leadership face remains to be seen. I think, ultimately, Mullah Baradar is going to be the one who has to show up at the table to really show that they're swinging the big bat politically. But in that interview, what was interesting was, I don't want to insult my colleagues at Al Jazeera, but there were a lot of softballs. But one of the softball answers that was given back from Stanigzai about sort of what he predicts for the future of women, for instance, was kind of the same old, same old. We plan to continue to rule in sort of the old Islamic way. And that's fine, but it's not 1990 anymore. So, they're on message rhetorically on their website, but they're kind of signaling in person and on camera, I think is a bit of a mess, and certainly does not bode well right now for a cohesive set of political negotiations from that side.
Thank you. Ahmed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming for today's event, and it's a pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. I think that the advantage of answering a question last is that you learn from insights of all other speakers. The disadvantage of that is that you're left with nothing to talk about. About the evolution of the Taliban as a movement, I'd like to just highlight a couple of key points that I've observed over the past 15 years or so in terms of their both political and military evolution. In terms of their military evolution, we've seen that the Taliban, since the initial years of post-US intervention, it has become more decentralized in terms of its military structure in Afghanistan. And secondly, also, it has a change from a very disorganized insurgent movement into a very organized shadow government. As per your question, that who leads it, how the organizational structure is, of course, the Taliban has its own leader, Mullah Haibatullah, Akhundzada, who's the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or leader of the faithful, a title that Mullah Omar had before. But then he also has two deputies. The leader, he's not very much in charge of the Taliban's day-to-day political and military operations, but it's mostly just his deputies, Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's also the leader of the Haqqani network, the most lethal branch of the Taliban, and also Mullah Yaqub, the son of Mullah Omar. And when it comes to the military operation, then Sirajuddin Haqqani has almost just taken over. He's the chief operational military commander of the Taliban. And then down that, you also see a Rahbari Shura, or the Leadership Council. And the Leadership Council has had something between 12 to 18 members. The number of members have changed over time, or according to different reports and sometimes intelligence reports that we've received. So they decide on major decisions, both in terms of political and military issues. And then the Taliban also has created a cabinet that people who are in charge of very similar to a government. They have Minister of Education, they have Ministry of Religious Affairs, Minister of just War and others. And then down that, mostly just inside then Afghanistan, as Ambassador Omar Samad pointed out, that the leadership is mostly just inside Pakistan. But inside Afghanistan, they also has established this shadow governors and different committees that are running the day-to-day operations and decisions. How the Taliban recruits? As pointed out before, from the refugee community inside Pakistan and also from the madrasas, but also they have increased their efforts inside Afghanistan into local communities. So the Taliban's recruitment and also their kind of mission has become more localized, and that's more in line with other regional and international terrorist groups that we've become, that they have put more emphasis on building that kind of support network into local communities. And in some ways, that makes it more difficult to deal with. That, for example, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, that now they have lost their caliphate, but they've become an insurgent movement. So it is now more difficult to deal with them. And the Taliban also have been putting emphasis on recruiting from local communities, people who have that kind of connections with the tribes, with the local communities, and at the same time they know what are the needs and requirements and the grievances of the local communities across the country. And geographically also, the Taliban were mostly just in the south and east, but they have now spread their areas of influence to all across Afghanistan, including to one peaceful north. We've also seen that in terms of their shadow governance, as was mentioned before, that they try to address some of the local needs of the population in terms of health, education, and other sectors. Because they don't have all the resources, then they have formal and informal deals with national and international NGOs, with the United Nations and others, to make sure that some of those services that they reach to the people. This is not because the Taliban has changed for good. This is because there has been pressure on them. Some people sometimes mention that the Taliban has allowed schools in certain areas, girls' schools. But the reality is that it has been the local pressure on them that have changed their minds to a certain extent. And in terms of their military operations, again, they have become more decentralized, more embedded with the local population. They have been more focusing on targeting the Afghan security forces rather than focusing on the international forces. And the reason is that they believe that the international forces are leaving, so the Afghan security forces are the permanent threat to them or to their aim of restoration of their own rule. They've also expanded their efforts to gain legitimacy abroad, and as we see that they now have deeper ties with regional countries from China, Russia to the Gulf states. But at the end, I'd like to also focus on how the Taliban has not evolved. One issue that the Taliban still is very much similar to the late 1990s, that still maintains very deep connections with regional and international terrorist groups. Despite the pledges that the Taliban have made to the United States recently, if you look at their actions, they still have very close ties with Al-Qaeda core, which is still active in the region. Some of the Al-Qaeda's bases that have been destroyed recently in Western or in Southern Afghanistan, they have been in areas that the Taliban have control or influence over. Their views on when it comes to human rights, women's rights have not changed. Yes, they pledged that if they come to power, their views have changed, but let's judge them by their actions, not words. There are more than 10 districts in Afghanistan that are under complete control of the Taliban, and in those districts, there are no single girls' school. So those views have not changed, and that's why it's difficult to just trust on some of the promises that they've made over the recent negotiations.
Panelists, for a long time, it didn't seem as if the Taliban, or for that matter, necessarily ourselves, were that anxious in serious negotiations. I think both were determined, if possible, to have a military solution. What's changed for the Taliban? Why are they now, why do they now seem willing to negotiate? But you can't ask that question, can you, without saying, but why won't they negotiate with the government? If it is about a power sharing, who do you share power with, if not the sitting government? So who'd like to comment on that?
Somebody else maybe this time.
Okay, who'd like to, Bill, you want to
Couple of
start?
thoughts? Yes. Well, firstly, the Taliban have consistently demanded, requested, however one phases it, discussions directly with the United States.
Yeah, okay.
So in that sense, what has been on offer through Ambassador Khalilzad's
Okay,
negotiation
why the United States?
is something they've wanted. Negotiating with the United States performs the function of delegitimating the Afghan government. Because given that the Taliban themselves are nominally an Afghan force, although they have significant transnational development, the natural inclination of the wider world is they speak to the government of your country. If you decline to do so and key actors then agree to speak to you without your being willing to do so, that has implications for the reputation of the government in the country itself. And this shouldn't be underestimated. In Hobbes's Leviathan, there's a great line which is often forgotten where Hobbes said, reputation of power is power. And that matters in Afghanistan because ordinary people may not have a great sense of the complexities of the constitution, but they tend to have an acute understanding of the evolution of power dynamics because that's central to day-to-day survival. And it's also one of the reasons why one needs to be exceedingly careful in doing reputational harm to the government of the day in Afghanistan, because regime change in Afghanistan tends to be produced not by one force grinding militarily through to the capital, but through a cascade where people realign themselves in the light of their assessment of who is becoming ascendant and who's in decline. That was how the communist regime collapsed in 1992 in the midst of UN efforts to arrange a transition. It was really how the Taliban regime collapsed in 2001 when the United States as a superior force appeared on the horizon. And anything that undermines the reputation as a credible force of the Afghan government assists the process of trying to trigger a cascade of that particular sort. There's also, I think, in the Taliban a sense that they are getting the smell of what the New York Times in an editorial earlier in the month called a negotiated capitulation. And who would not be attracted by that smell? And then the third point, this is the most problematic, but there's someone many of us here will know, Professor Barnett Rubin, recently tweeted that there'd been a $12 billion gift to Pakistan from the Saudis and the Emiratis at the behest of the United States to get the Taliban to the table. And money can speak with a mellifluous voice in many different environments.
So you don't think that was in Saudis, that was a Saudi initiative so much?
No, well, the irony is the Taliban want to meet with the Saudis if they can avoid it. They detest Prince Salman.
Yes.
And one of the reasons, in a sense, that it was convenient for them not to go to Islamabad the other day was that the Pakistanis probably wanted to get a nice photograph of the Saudis and the Taliban together.
Yeah.
I think that, continuing along the same line as Bill, the environment has shifted, not only inside Afghanistan, but also in the region and globally. The strategic decision by the United States to disengage from Afghanistan, either gradual or over a certain period of time, which is being discussed right now, that obviously gave other stakeholders, including the Taliban, the opportunity to jump to the occasion and to say, well, we have the momentum, we think we have the momentum, we are in ascendancy, we are controlling more territory than we did before, even though the population centers are still mostly under government control. Everybody's tired. There's fatigue. And so maybe we can get the best deal out of this possible. And so the decision in Washington to disengage in a certain fashion, and this has been going back and forth as to how this fashion is being shaped, once we thought that it could be a tweet. Another time we thought that maybe it will take 6 months. Another time now we think that may take a year to 18 months. But it's very much geared towards the 2020 US elections. And so the Taliban are obviously doing their calculations alongside their advisors and supporters, and they're figuring out that this is the best time for them to aim to talk to the Americans. And the Americans are ready to do so because they have this strategic decision that they have taken. Now, on the other side, in Kabul, unfortunately, Kabul is not united. And every effort to unify Kabul's political class so far has not materialized, and more work needs to be done in order to unify everyone under one umbrella, including the government, with the government playing its role, and making sure that there is a negotiating team, as Khalilzad has said, that can then engage the Taliban. Now, this is where one of the impasses exists right now, because it's an issue of control. It's an issue of who is going to speak on behalf of whom. And so we Afghans have to find the right formula for this, and this is being discussed right now, in order for a negotiating team representing the rest of Afghanistan's, defending all those rights that we all talk about all day long, can then sit down and engage the Taliban. Government included, again. So this is where we stand right now. This is why things are not moving fast enough, and time is of the essence. And when time becomes of the essence, obviously, games can be played with time. One side wants to prolong it for one reason or another side wants to accelerate it for one reason or another side wants to have a quick and dirty solution, another one wants a quick and clean solution, so on and so forth. And this is exactly where we stand right now. There's going to be discussions tomorrow in Ankara between the Russians and the Americans. I think that's pretty significant. If the results out of these discussions in Ankara bring more coordination between the Americans and the Russians, then obviously that could play a role. On Monday, there are discussions again, if it doesn't go in a different direction. There's supposed to be discussions again between the Taliban and the Americans. It was thought that maybe, again, a contingent of Afghans may participate. But I don't think that a contingent of Afghans should participate or could participate unless, it's force majeure, because it has to be all-inclusive. It has to include all Afghan political elements that matter. Why does that matter? Because you cannot have a just, comprehensive, durable peace in a country like Afghanistan after 40 years unless everybody's at the table. You can't just have one person or this entity or that entity. You have to have everybody at the table, everybody that counts in Afghanistan. Otherwise, things may go in the wrong direction down the road, and you don't want that to happen again.
Even though everyone at the table may disagree.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The reason for sitting at the table is to disagree. They're sitting at the table because they are disagreeing. It's in order for them to start talking to each other and start addressing real issues that matter for the future of Afghanistan.
Yeah, sure. I agree with Professor Mali that the Taliban's position has consistently been to talk with the United States about the withdrawal of foreign troops. And so far, the Taliban position has been the same. What has changed is the U.S. position, because the U.S. government has, in the past, said that any peace process should be Afghan-led, but now it has directly engaged with the Taliban about the potential withdrawal of foreign troops. If you look at the history of Taliban diplomacy, you see that the Taliban, from the very outset, from their rise in 1994, has used negotiation more as a tactic to complement its military and political ends rather than making peace. In 1994, they started these local deals with local warlords to undermine the government in Kabul, and much of their military expansion to west in 1995 or north, and later even in the seizure of Kabul, that were through co-option of local warlords and through making local deals rather than through military operations. So what we see today is also that the question that why the Taliban is engaging in peace talks if they are not sincere about making a deal, and these talks have been going on for more than a decade. It is that because if you look at the past one decade, it's been only just the Taliban which has benefited from the talks. The Taliban has not been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States or its European allies. Mainly it is because to keep the door open for a reconciliation process in the country. Even when the United States designated the Haqqani Network as a terrorist organization, it did not go aggressively against financial resources, not to scuttle the peace process at that time. And secondly, it also has received a lot of unilateral concessions in terms of prisoners release. Hundreds of Taliban fighters and commanders have been released were released by the Karzai government. Many of them just returned to fighting. The talks also have helped Taliban to expand its international legitimacy from a terrorist organization or militant organization into a legitimate opposition party. We were always talking about Taliban sanctuaries in Pakistan, but now they have diplomatic relations with most of the regional countries, from China, Russia, to the Gulf regions. They have office in Qatar. They travel freely across the Gulf region for public relations campaign, for fundraising, and other issues. So, and the current talks also helps the Taliban in a way that if they can just get the U.S. forces out, the possibility for a military victory for them would be much easier in the future. And secondly, also, as it was mentioned before, they're using these talks to delegitimize the existing political order or the constitutional order in Afghanistan. And already we see negative effects of that they are talking with political leaders, with warlords, with power holders at local and regional levels, but not with the Afghan government. So that is the same strategy similar to 1990s, that to achieve their political and military aim more through diplomatic means, something that they have not been able to do through military means.
Yeah, I mean, again, they've been talking about talks for a long time. They've been seeking engagement with the United States from the outset. I think we all know that now, and the record reflects that their line has been the same. Troops go, and then we'll think about the rest, basically. Nothing has really changed in terms of the rhetorical stance of the Taliban as to why they're doing what they're doing in terms of negotiations. What has changed, I agree, is the momentum. But I think actually this last year or so, there's also clearly some understanding that locking in the United States means locking in regional partners as well. And in a way, it's a very clever game of cards that's being played here. And we've seen now, of course, that in reading that initial signal from the United States as early as 2012, where Hillary Clinton said we're going to talk about talks and so forth, and talk, fight, win, whatever the rhetoric was. That was the first signal, but there were other signals, and I think those signals were the release of 5 Taliban from Guantanamo. We cannot forget the importance of these confidence-building measures in terms of upping the ante for the political leadership of the Taliban as well as the military. It's been extremely important that the United States on its own side has been able to show, okay, we mean business. And here are the steps we're prepared to take. We're prepared to lift the travel ban under certain circumstances. You can go to Paris. You can go to Pakistan. You can go to the UAE on a temporary visa, basically. In fact, many Taliban members have been sanctioned individually. It is true that as a group today, unlike al-Qaeda, they sit in a different category on the UN sanctions, but they have been sanctioned as individuals. And that has been another lever of confidence building, is lifting certain individuals off those sanctions lists. That's been very important. There's a missed opportunity, I want to point out, from the US side and also from the international community side. The money matters to the Taliban. And in actual fact, they lost a lot in 2001 when they were pushed out of power, and there's a lot that they don't have access to as individually and as a group. If we're not using that, if the United States is not using that as a lever in their negotiations with the Taliban, that's a very big mistake. It seems like rhetorically the focus and emphasis on troop withdrawal is kind of the whole game from the White House perspective. I hope that on the other side, somewhere in the background, more detailed discussions are going on about what it means for these different individual leaders to be reinstated as human beings with a real political ability to move around in the world freely. Freedom of movement means a lot to guys who are making a lot of money at being representatives of a portion of the Afghan people. From a bigger perspective on what they want, what their demands are, we've also seen that cutting out the Afghan government has been a big part of kind of their demand, which is we don't want to talk with you, you're not legitimate. It's a little bit more, I think, complex because, in fact, interestingly, they're now talking with Karzai, who is now out of power but seeking to come back into power, and he sees this, again, as a pathway to reinstating himself politically and staying in the game. That's a pretty dangerous signal. That should tell us something about the Taliban's intent. It certainly is very different than the approach taken by Hizb Islami, which I think engaged, a little bit more frontally with the Afghan government, with members of the Afghan government, even in quiet, and I think managed really successfully to take hold of certain ministries in large part because they hived themselves off as a political organization. When we start seeing the Taliban mimicking that example, then maybe we're starting to see something different about the quality of the negotiations and the quality of the demands.
Yeah. Let me ask this. We say here, it's almost a mantra, there's no military solution. Therefore, inevitably, there has to be one. We certainly have come around to that. Even our military has come around to that. Have the Taliban come to the same outcome? Or is it possible that the diplomatic route is a way to pave the way for an eventual, assuming now they don't believe that's ever going to be consummated, that kind of agreement, that it is ultimately the way to power? Why compromise? Because could you not say that if what they wanted was a compromise, could they not have started that process already several years ago? Certainly, if you wanted to, in a given take on solution here, why not begin that negotiation? Is it therefore that they have now feel that they're in a military position of strength that they can use the diplomatic to complete the process of domination rather than compromise?
I'll jump in, actually.
Yes, please.
So in that interview with Al Jazeera that I referenced earlier, Sher Mohammed Staniksai mentioned that ultimately they don't believe that a military solution is in the offing. Now that's the rhetorical stance. And that may be true. As long as the United States stays in the game and has air power to bring to bear, has extensive communications, network communications to support their military efforts, we are ultimately at a military
But
stalemate.
we've signaled that,
signaled
don't take that for granted.
We've signaled that the boots will go.
Okay.
That's what the United States has signaled. There's been no signal, and I don't think there would be any appetite in any White House or Congress or National Security Council or in the Pentagon or frankly even in the State Department for a situation in which boots on the ground translates into nothing. This is not a negotiating position of walking off into the dark. You can almost bet that the plan B is some sort of air overwatch and assistance, which means that the Taliban should really reconsider. They should not mistake territorial control for strategic advantage, because that's not the game here. And I think that, I suspect that, powerful neighbors like Russia and China, if you've seen the Washington Post coverage the other day about China's outposts in Tajikistan, yeah, they're interested. They don't want to see any overrun over their ostensible borders either. And that will be brought to bear as well. So, the military solution may be something that they sort of acknowledge that is not possible. I think in their minds, as long as they maintain their kind of connection strategically to supporters in Saudi and the Gulf, as well as Al-Qaeda, quietly, that they may have greater military advantage, especially if the United States goes away.
Now, I want to get, but should we put into the equation here whether the Kabul political system can hold as well? If that, because of things you were talking, if that should begin to fall apart, particularly with elections looming here, that would change, yes, the dynamics quite a bit. Bill, you about?
Yeah. Coming to your basic question, I think it's actually quite important to distinguish between sincere and ostensible compromise. And this was the problem that confronted the Cambodian transition between 1991 and perhaps 1998, that it became painfully clear after the UN-run election in Cambodia in 1993 that the Cambodian People's Party under Hun Sen was willing to compromise until they got sufficiently close to untrammeled power that they could move to consolidate their position. And as a result, by the use of salami tactics against their opponents, they'd actually obtained complete control of the Cambodian government by 1997, and having lost the 1993 election, ran the 1998 election, and Hun Sen is still there. And there's a broader lesson from that, which is that negotiations are often seen as occurring in a stable environment. But in fact, the environment within which negotiations take place of this kind, at least, is almost always a dynamic one where the potential for sudden and unexpected changes in the position of political actors should be taken for granted. And there are two types that I'd just like to mention quickly there. The first is that the negotiating environment may change. You may get a collapse in a particular political force because of the spectacle of the direction in which things are tending as a negotiation process goes forward. But you can also get instability in the objectives of parties as they get closer to what might be their real objective. If they are insincere in their commitment to negotiations, then they change their approach. And we have one classic historical example of this, which was the British negotiations with Germany in September 1938. Where the British Prime Minister arrived in Bad Godesberg, having with great difficulty secured the approval of his cabinet for demands that the Germans had made at Berchtesgaden, and when he presented that agreement, the response he got was, "I'm sorry, but that doesn't apply anymore." Because the very perception that concessions were in the offing led Hitler to the view that it was time to ask for even more. And that, I think, is also the difficulty. It's an even greater difficulty in this particular situation because of the instability in Washington. It's one thing for Ambassador Halilzad to say nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, but he's ultimately not the final decision maker. It's the president. And every tweet that goes out from the White House attracts attention from circles in Afghanistan as a signal about what the intention of the United States might be. And I think you can easily envisage a cascade being triggered in Afghanistan by some injudicious tweets from the USA that end up being reported in Etalate Ruza, Hashtisop or something like that.
Yeah.
Let me just add also that as far as the military solution issue is concerned, Marvin, a Talib, I don't know which one it was, a Talib leader was quoted as saying that it's easier to wage war than to make peace. So they're looking at it from that perspective. And we also do know that, and if we don't, I think that there's enough evidence to probably make us think twice about whether there's a war and a peace lobby within the Taliban itself. There's a war and peace lobby developing again outside of the Taliban circles. And there's a lot of delusion, there are a lot of people who are now pro-war, they used to be against war, now they are pro-peace, they used to be against peace. It's shifting. It's shifting with politics. It's shifting with Washington politics, it's shifting with regional politics, it's shifting with Afghan politics. And that is going to hurt Afghanistan. And my fear is that we are not looking at the situation very realistically. We're all looking at it from our own political perspective, narrow political perspective. And this is why we have to open up and look at it from a very wide angle of what opportunity exists right now. Are we going to grab it or not? Or are we going to go through this slow, grinding, never-ending war? And at the end of the day, it's the Afghan people who are going to suffer. More money will be spent. And I'm not sure who's going to win at the end or not. I'm not sure who's going to win or lose. But definitely the Afghan people will lose. They look at the region. Look at the region. What are they saying? From Pakistan to China to Russia to Iran. Forget about the Gulf states and others. They all seem to be more or less saying the same thing, more or less. And now there's an American peace process that is trying to make sense of all of this. The Afghan people, and I'm not again talking about the politicians, the Afghan people are sick and tired of war. We lose between 100 to 200 human beings a day. 45,000 security forces were killed only in the last 4.5 years, not counting civilians. We can play politics in Washington and in other capitals, but we need to really look at what needs to be done and can be done today. As far as the lobby within the Taliban is concerned, where's Mullah Baradar? We talked about their structure. Why is he not coming out? This is the guy who was supposed to be somewhat sympathetic to peace. Why are we now hearing of this Haqqani guy who is in prison in Kabul somewhere, who now is on the negotiating team on the Taliban side? So that should raise red flags, obviously, about what Taliban intentions are. And so, in my opinion, when we look at it and looking at the future of this engagement, Candice alluded to the fact that maybe we will, we will have a continued American presence, NATO presence or not. This is a key question. This is an issue that is being discussed between the Americans and the Taliban, and others are involved directly and indirectly, except for Kabul politicians. There is very little chance that the Americans and NATO will leave 100%. I even think that the Taliban, in this particular deal or particular framework that is being worked on, whereby they have to agree in order for the Americans to talk about withdrawal, how it will end up is a different issue, that the Taliban will have to agree to some kind of counterterrorism platform. Counterterrorism platform is an American red line from what we hear and see and read. And this counterterrorism platform will have to be multinational and will include, most probably, as has been alluded on many occasions, I'm not making this up, an American footprint, as well as other footprints. There's talk now of a new special U.S. envoy for Afghanistan, beyond what is UNAMA is doing, someone who can deal with the overarching issues. There's talk of the UN now getting involved in trying to sort out some of the regional, international issues, including a peace dividend if there is a peace settlement, and how the international community can then, again, get involved with funding in Afghan development and so on and so forth for the country. All thinking that there will be a peace deal, there will be a counterterrorism platform, there will be a new political roadmap, I don't know if it's going to be a bond type thing, or whether it's going to be an Afghan law jirga type thing, or it's going to be an election type thing. We don't know those things yet. They're all out there and being discussed. But as long as we remain fragmented, and this is my message again to Kabul, as long as Afghans remain fragmented on that side, nothing is going to move forward. And they would have missed the boat and a chance to come together, agree on the red lines. I sent a note last year to all the Afghan leaders, last year before peace talks ever even were mentioned. And I told them, you have to come up with red lines soon, all of you, whether you like each other or not, whether you're going to go and compete against each other in elections or not. Red lines about women, red lines about elections, red lines about constitution, red lines about the political order, red lines about the institutions that have been built and protecting them, so on and so forth. Well, they missed the boat again. So again, they have a chance today, and I hope that they realize that.
Okay. I just wanted to remind us, if anything, the Taliban has indicated how much patience they have. I don't think we should underestimate that. Also, as we talk about peace, whose peace? Who owns that peace is a very important. I think all of us want to see cessation of violence, but it's very clear that the terms of peace are really what we're getting to, and to remind ourselves about how all of this positioning here is to get us to the first step in what could be a laborious, given the history of these kinds of process here, which takes place over time, and as Bill points out, in a moving picture here, background to what's going on. We're going to have to conclude very shortly because I do want to give you an opportunity. Ahmed?
Yeah, just a couple of points. In terms of just the peace and war lobby within the Taliban, I agree, there are just voices that who want some kind of settlement, and those irreconcilables that who just do not accept anything short of a military victory or a full restoration of the Taliban rule. But if you look back at the history of the Taliban, these peace and war lobbies have always existed within the Taliban since their rise in 1994. But unfortunately, it has been mostly just the hardliners which have had the final say, not just the relatively moderate voices. Whether it was in 94 and 95 about reaching an agreement with the Kabul government for some kind of power sharing to stabilize the country and end the civil war, or it has been over the past decade. So those people who are now negotiating with the United States or with Afghan political leaders, they're mostly just those ones who were called the Taliban diplomats in the 1990s. They were just in Kabul, most of them. Mr. Stanigzai served in the cabinet just as a deputy minister at that time. And these people in Kabul, even at that time, some of them were raising voices for allowing girls' education or about building better relationship with the outside world. Some of them saw Al-Qaeda's presence in eastern Afghanistan as a liability. But these voices had always were overruled by the hardliners, which were ruling mostly just from Kandahar. So the question remains that even if there are pledges now by Taliban so-called diplomats in Qatar or in Moscow and other platforms, first, whether they are sincere or not, but even if they are sincere, these are the real voices of those who are the decision makers, which are just the Taliban Leadership Council. So that's just one key issue. And secondly, I think that for reaching a durable and sustainable peace, there are just some key elements that, key requirements. And first of all, I think that that's one thing that Ambassador Samad mentioned, that there is a need for a national consensus. Within Afghanistan, there is need for unity of efforts, that all Afghan politicians with the government, they work collectively for a platform for peace. Otherwise, it will undermine the efforts for peace, and that will benefit only the Taliban. For the Taliban, they have to show in action that they are distancing themselves from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist and regional groups, not just through words. There needs to be improvement in security and governance, because even if there is a deal or some political arrangement that cannot be sustainable, there needs to be also an enduring commitment of the international community for the enforcement of a deal and to make sure that all sides abide by any deals if one is just reached. And lastly, and I think very importantly, is that there needs to be some kind of regional consensus on the issue of and cooperation on the issue of Afghanistan or the peace process, that at least some sides are not left out so they do not play the spoiler role. I know that this is much easier said than done, and this has been tried. Regional countries, they have competing interests, although most of them, they see a stable Afghanistan good for their national security interests, for regional economic connectivity. But because of the competing interests that they have amongst themselves, and secondly, also some of the countries like Russia and Iran, they have differences with the United States, that makes the regional cooperation more difficult. I would disagree with Professor Rubin's assumption that, sorry? Oh. No, it was from tweet from Ambassador, from Professor Rubin, that who had said that the Crown Prince trip to Pakistan has been, or the billions of dollars of aid to Pakistan or investment in Pakistan has to do with Afghanistan. I don't believe so. I think it has more to do with other geopolitical needs of Saudi Arabia, and it has more to do with Iran than Afghanistan. And it also has to do more to do inter-GCC rivalry, because Qatar is leading now the peace efforts. Saudi Arabia also wants to be a player. So these differences will make any kind of peace process more difficult, not easy.
I'd like to turn, just one thought here, that what we're seeing here is, I think, a question which is a very basic one. To what extent can there be a reconciliation here between those who sincerely believe in an Islamic emirate, in rule by Sharia, and those who very sincerely, certainly on the government's part, believe in a liberal, democratic, constitutional system? Now, it may be that they are, but I think that that is to be proven here, very much to be proven. So, please introduce yourself, affiliation, name, affiliation, and keep your question to one question and keep it brief so we can get as many questions in this remaining 20 minutes almost as we have. Okay, this gentleman had his hand up first, so let's give him an opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mushtaba from Free Muslim Center for De-Radicalization. One question you said, and I'm going to ask one question. Are Taliban in this negotiation giving legitimacy to the minorities they killed within the past 20 years? That's all.
I mean, I think the blank answer is no. And I think, that's a very big question that has to be asked as part of the negotiation process. To what degree, we've talked about women, and we've seen sort of rhetoric around women, and they'll be able to, I think the words were, they'll be able to go to school, they will be able to go to work, according to Afghan Islamic custom. I didn't hear they will be able to hold office. They will be able to exert political power. I haven't heard. I haven't heard.
No presidency.
Exactly, no presidency. I haven't heard we are prepared to protect ethnic minorities, religious minorities. When we hear that, that's going to be a sign that they're leaning more toward real reconciliation, I think. To your point about the reconciliation between the two, I think the constituency for that liberal, westerly democracy is pretty thin. And I think we've got, I'm not saying that it's not there, it's there, but it is, I think, jaundiced by an experience of the last 17 years in which political participation has meant buying your way or shooting your way into the center of power. So maybe it's not such a big distance to reconcile.
But many of these politicians who you're dealing with are a product of that system, and they have they're stakeholders in that, and these are the very people you're going to be negotiating, even if they're not entirely representative. Would you agree?
I would agree, but I would agree that there will always be a constituency. If those are the two poles that we have, there's always going to be a constituency outside of that, looking for either greater political power and protection and willing to take up arms to do so, or looking for those same things and willing to clog the system politically, making it difficult to have a cohesive whole, as Omar has alluded to.
Or even say, peace is worth a Taliban rule.
Yeah.
We saw that in '94.
Can I just say one thing
Yeah,
about,
please.
Let's call it ethnic relations. In Afghanistan, we've had ethnic issues and relation problems for the past many decades. I hope that it will be an item to be discussed during negotiations if and when we reach that point. But look at the people who went and spoke to the Taliban, at least in Moscow. You have the Hazaras to some extent represented, you have the Uzbeks to some extent represented, the Tajiks to some extent. And I think that it is very important to make sure that anything, when we use the word inclusive, that is what it means. It means that it has to include all Afghan communities. When we say inclusive and comprehensive, it means that it has to cover all these issues. So the Taliban seem to be shifting in that direction, but they have to be tested. It has to be in action, not just words. Everything has to be tested in action, not just words. It has to be verifiable, and we have to have mechanisms for each and every issue that comes up on the table. We have to have a mechanism not only for verification, but also for enforcement.
This gal back here. Yes, you.
My name is Mariam Jalalzadeh, and I'm an analyst with CIGAR. My question is about whether do we know the Taliban knows what they want to happen with their fighters after a deal is negotiated.
With their fighters?
With their fighters, as well as the Afghan security
question.
forces.
Good question.
And whether the U.S. should or can play a role in what's going to happen, whether they want military integration or civilian reintegration.
Mayor?
Yeah, please.
That is a very important question, a very critical, key issue that has not been addressed, at least publicly yet. It may have been addressed in private, and it hasn't gone very far, which means that there is pushback, and there's obviously some resistance to trying to talk about demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. The reintegration part is probably the easiest. It's the first two that are the most difficult. We have no idea what the Taliban stance is on these issues. As I said, if it has been discussed privately, we do not know. But they have to be discussed at some critical point, because without having an idea of what they're thinking in terms of disarming and how to do it, over what time, over what period of time, under what conditions, is a very, very important matter.
Can I quickly
No?
add something?
Okay, good, please.
Sure. From what we know from the open source information, there has not been any debate by the Taliban leaders about the concept of a government, that if they return to power, what kind of governance just they will have. They've only mentioned about a Sharia-based government. And as Ambassador Samad mentioned, the issue of just disarmament and demobilization and reintegration, that is something that I think that will be discussed in future meetings between the U.S. and Taliban officials. But one thing that I wanted to raise here is that so far the Taliban has shown, when it comes to just talks with the United States, some unity of command, some cohesiveness. And the ceasefire that we saw between the Afghan government and the Taliban during the religious holiday of Eid, the ceasefire was not violated. So that was a demonstration of just chain of command by the Taliban, mostly just to the United States, that we control our fighters. But if there is any kind of deal, particularly if there is any power sharing arrangement between the Taliban and the Afghan government, or between the Taliban and the United States, which may include a small footprint of American forces in Afghanistan, then that will test that cohesiveness of the Taliban. And then we will see whether those local commanders and those fighters will adhere to any decision that may be made by their political leaders.
Bill, you want to say?
Yes, just a footnote to what Ahmed said there. When one looks at the ceasefire that took place at the time of Eid al-Fitr last year, it's a good time to have a ceasefire because people are not that keen to be fighting other people anyway. But there was a sufficient degree of fraternisation between ordinary level Taliban and people in Afghan communities to prompt a statement from the political leadership discouraging anything like that in the future. And I think that does point to a fear that the Taliban have, that a ceasefire that looked in any way durable could actually see some of their troops melting away into communities. And for that reason, I'd be surprised if they agree to any kind of ceasefire in the foreseeable future. But if they're looking for ways to deal with people who could potentially be fractious in the aftermath of an agreement, one way is to try to get them into a regular army structure of some sort, with the reward system that flows from that.
Yeah, but
whether they could do that's another question.
But what I was saying was that if there is some kind of that kind of agreement about the integration of that into a national army, there could be defections, because we've already seen defections. For example, ISIS is more a splintering of the Taliban, Afghan, Pakistani Taliban groups rather than a natural extension of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and also similarly the Mullah Rasul group in Western Afghanistan. So if there is some kind of that arrangement, we might see more defections.
And there's also the possibility of an acceleration of defections from the Afghan National Army now. Because in a sense, do you really want to go and die in a ditch somewhere if people who've until recently been part of your own country's political elite are being led in prayers in a Russian hotel by a Talib?
So
similar to after the Soviet Union left.
Yeah.
So integrating the Afghan military and militias is another issue which I think is parallels what you do with the Taliban, because in both cases, integrate them into society without jobs, without economic growth. For many of them, it has been their martial arts which has kept them really, since they matured, alive. And so it's a much larger question. Okay, down here, this gentleman at the far left here. I'd like to get in several more, so please keep remarks very short.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Akab Malik. I'm, or Malik Akab Alizay Durrani. I'm currently a Fulbright scholar at the Elliott School. I've been away from this subject area for a few years because I'm completely engrossed with the global power transfer to the East, but I spent my PhD time in Afghanistan looking at the dynamics of conflict there. And I think, as a question, when it comes down to negotiations, and you've been talking about this, but nothing conclusive as far as Taliban is concerned, that they've always thought, and as any military strategist would do, that military aspect of the conflict is a subset of the negotiations to get to a position of influence, as they had wanted to do for quite a long time, and they are doing so. So it's a balance between whether they talk or not, and utilize military means to get to a position where they feel comfortable, where they're strong enough to negotiate on a platform where they've got that influence for the future as they envisage it. But that future in itself is dependent upon their philosophy, which nothing's been really talked about here, and how they really think. And you just term it in terms of Islam Sharia, but it's very different from that. The Deobandi ideas, input from Salafist ideas from the Middle East, for example, and how that would impact on the wider Afghan community. I just want your input on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, actually, because someone in the UN said to me the other day, this is not a negotiation about fishing quotas. It's a negotiation where there are real issues of fundamental values reflected by the different parties. The Asia Foundation survey conducted last year suggested that 82.4% of the Afghan population had no sympathy whatever with the Taliban. So we're actually talking about a situation in which there is a value gulf that can easily be blanched out of the discussion if we see it as simply a negotiation about interests. But it's more than that. I see no evidence whatsoever that the Taliban, if they got anywhere near power, would be remotely pluralist in their approach to politics. If you look at the way in which they word comments about women's rights, it's essentially a recipe for going back to what they had in the late 1990s. I was in Afghanistan at that time during the Taliban period. There were women in the workforce. They were just completely segregated from men, and they were second-class citizens. And I suspect that's very much the vision that a lot of people in the Taliban movement still entertain for an ideal state. It's a very different way of looking at the world from one which is grounded in the values of the 2004 Constitution. The final point I'd make is that Afghanistan is a country which has been more affected by globalisation than any other country in the world in the last 2 decades. And that's particularly apparent in young Afghans who've been exposed to forces of globalisation that no previous Afghan generation had ever encountered. And that has, if anything, magnified the scale of the gulf between the kind of values that have animated the Taliban in the past and the kind of values which matter to a lot of people in the Afghan population, which, as Ashraf Ghani reminds us, becomes more urbanised and younger every day that passes.
And we're talking about human capital here.
Yes.
Which did not exist in the past.
No.
And because of globalization and because of the refugee experience. So, Candice, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the question of values. I think it's a good question, and I reflect on the various times in my past that I've talked with various members of the Taliban and think about kind of their mien and their obsession with 2 very key things. One is control over the justice system, and at the local level and potentially at the national level. What that means with today's Taliban leadership is a little bit unclear, but what it has meant, in practical terms, is local level dispute resolution over questions actually that the Afghan government hasn't been very good at solving, like questions around land rights, water use, the building and development in a given area, the use of a school, all these things that the Afghan government, frankly, just hasn't had very much success in doing in a cohesive manner. The Taliban has tried to use its cohesive sense of their interpretation of Islam as a means of being an arbiter of justice. So I certainly think that one demand, politically for them, if there is any shift that's really substantive, would be we want a piece of the justice ministry. We want a piece, maybe less of the defense, although certainly there's good grounds for that, but probably the Ministry of Interior, Borders and Customs would be of great interest to them. The Supreme Court, et cetera. Now, just quickly to wrap up, they can make these demands, and they actually have a chance of having a real impact on the constitutional structure of Afghanistan, in large part because every single member of the Afghan government that has ever been in power has failed to address the constitutional flaws of its government. They do not take it seriously. They do not understand the urgency of fixing the disparity between the apex court, with fixing the authorities of the Attorney General, of fixing the authorities of the Commander-in-Chief. That structure has never been touched. It's never been discussed. It is not part of the political platform of Ashraf Ghani. It wasn't of Mr. Karzai. This continual failure is something that not only the Taliban, but any other comer is going to be able to exploit for the next couple of generations.
You forgot to mention the scale of corruption. And that has helped the Taliban quite a bit. It continues to help the Taliban quite a bit. And unfortunately, we haven't done a very good job. I would just simply say that when it comes to values and philosophy and so on and so forth, I would simply just divide them into three groups. You have the hardcore ideologues who have been influenced by non-Afghan, non-traditional Afghan thinking that comes from wherever and goes through that madrasa system in Pakistan mainly. You have those who are the traditionalists. The other day I was listening to Mullah Qalamuddin, who was the head of Vice and Virtue under the Taliban, sitting on a late night show like the Johnny Carson show in Kabul and answering questions about, did you whip women or not? Did you do this and that? Have you ever fallen in love? Have you ever read a book about this and that? It was amazing to see this guy who used to run Vice and Virtue under the Taliban answer these questions. So I realized he comes from the traditional school that was based in Afghanistan. And you have those guys versus the ideologues that are influenced. And then you have those in the middle who are sort of a mix of the two. How are we going to manage this over time and streamline this is going to be a big question that has to be addressed.
And related to this certainly is to ask, I think, two questions here. Can you imagine a Afghan government, maybe with a minister here and a minister there, acceding to having an Ashraf Ghani or a Dr. Abdullah or any of those as president, as head of state? Because we would have to accept, if we were dividing things up, that this would be the outcome. The other is, what if it is a sharing ultimately of power? That means a competition for power. Mm-hmm. What's the context for that competition? If, as the Taliban say, they have no intention of becoming a political party, then what is the vehicle? Bill?
Can I make two quick comments there? One
and we're
is,
going to wind up.
Yeah. The first is about peace agreements in general. People often seem to assume that when you have some kind of peace agreement, politics stops, that harmony and unity breaks up. But of course, that's not the case. You tend to have profound tensions that persist into the phases of a different peace agreement, and very often the institutions that have been assembled are too fragile at that stage to accommodate the scale of the tensions that come around. And the other issue, of course, is Pakistan and ISI, and where ISI fits into all this. It's been notably missing from a lot of the press discussion, but there's an old saying, why talk to the monkey when you can talk to the organ grinder? And there would be certain red lines that Pakistan would have, and I would guess one of them would be that the Afghan leadership be not one that would be unacceptable to them on a whole range of different criteria.
And that India not have a foothold.
That's right. And
we've run out of our time, and we've run out of panelists because two of our panelists have to leave right now. Otherwise, I could see us going on here for at least another half hour. And you've been a wonderful audience, and I hope we're leaving you with a better sense here about the Taliban, even if we haven't been able to even come close to answering all the questions. Thank you for coming.